You know what's funny? People are terrified of the wrong things. They're scared of heights, of spiders, and of public speaking, of dying alone. But nobody warns you about the quiet ones, the ones who've been through hell and came back, and decided they don't owe anyone a damn thing anymore. The trauma-born loners, not the ones who chose solitude because it's trendy or aesthetic. No, I'm talking about the ones who were forged in isolation, the ones who learned early that people lie, that safety is a myth, and that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. And here's the thing nobody tells you. Being around them will mess you up. Not because they're violent, not because they're cruel, but because they operate on a level of truth most people spend their whole lives avoiding. They don't play the game. They don't pretend. They don't collapse to make you comfortable. And that is what shakes people to their core. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to understand why these people are either the best thing that ever happened to you, or the worst, depending on how honest you're willing to be with yourself. When someone says a person shook them to their core, most people imagine some big dramatic confrontation, yelling and accusations, somebody getting called out in front of everyone. But that's not how trauma-born loners operate. They don't need the drama. They don't need the stage. What they do is far more unsettling. They disrupt illusions, the ones you've been living inside for years, the ones that keep you safe from the uncomfortable truths you've been avoiding. And they do it just by existing, by standing in their truth, calm and unbothered, completely self-contained. That's the shake. It's not an earthquake, it's a mirror. And most people, they don't like what they see. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Trauma-born loners are hyper-observant. They had to be. When you grow up in chaos, in dysfunction, in environments where people's moods could flip in a second, you learn to read the room like your life depends on it. Because sometimes it did. So they notice things, not the surface stuff, not what you say but what you don't say. The micro-expressions, the tone shifts, the way someone's energy changes when a certain topic comes up, the inconsistencies between what someone claims to believe and how they actually behave. They see the gap, and they don't call it out usually. Because honestly, they don't care enough to fix you. But their silence on it? That silence is deafening. Because when you're used to people nodding along, agreeing with your version of reality, co-signing your bullshit, suddenly being around someone who just doesn't, it's unnerving. You start wondering, do they see through me? And the answer is yes, yes they do. But here's the twist. They're not judging you for it, or who knows, maybe they are. But they're just not participating in your denial anymore. Let me paint you a picture. You're someone who's built an identity around being the strong one, the person everyone leans on, the fixer, the rock. And then you meet a trauma-born loner. And you do what you always do. You offer advice and you try to help. You position yourself as the wise, stable one. But they don't react the way people usually do. They don't lean in. They don't ask for more. They don't look at you like you just handed them the keys to enlightenment. They just nod politely, maybe say thanks, and move on. And suddenly you feel off, because your whole identity was built on being needed. And this person doesn't need you. Not because they're cold, not because they're rude, but because they've already been through their own hell, and they've figured out how to survive it on their own. They don't need saving. And that makes you confront something uncomfortable. If I'm not needed, then who am I? This is the one that really gets people. Trauma-born loners don't need your advice, your pity, your rescue. They're not performing for you. They're not trying to impress you. They're not waiting for you to notice them. They're just existing on their own terms. And for people whose entire sense of self is built on being something to others, that's destabilizing as hell. Because suddenly the script doesn't work. You can't charm them. You can't guilt-trip them. You can't manipulate them with praise or criticism. They're just solid, self-contained, complete on their own. And that forces you to ask yourself a question most people avoid. Am I complete on my own? Spoiler alert, most people aren't. Most people are fragments held together by external validation. And when they're around someone who isn't, someone who's whole without needing anything from anyone, it highlights the emptiness. Let's be real for a second. A lot of people build their entire identity around being needed. They're the therapist friend, the advice giver, the shoulder to cry on, the fixer. And on the surface, that looks noble. But dig a little deeper and you'll find something else: control. Because when people need you, when they depend on you, you have power. You get to be the center. You get to be important. You get to feel valuable. But what happens when someone doesn't need you? What happens when someone is perfectly fine without you? That's when the mask slips. Suddenly it's not about helping, it's about ego. Why don't they need me? What's wrong with them? Are they too proud to ask for help? No, they just don't need it. And trauma-born loners, they spot this pattern immediately. Because they've seen it before. The person who offers help but attaches invisible strings to it. The person who wants to be needed more than they want to actually help. So they politely decline. And that refusal, that's the shake. Here's another thing that messes people up. Trauma-born loners don't engage in emotional games. They won't chase you when you pull away, respond to passive-aggressive hints, decode your subtle signals, participate in power struggles, argue over things that don't matter, get pulled into manufactured drama. They either show up honestly or they step back. There's no in-between. And for people who are used to controlling others through confusion, through mixed signals, through hot and cold behavior, this is infuriating. Because those tactics only work on people who are desperate for connection. And trauma-born loners, they're not desperate. They've already been abandoned. They've already been betrayed. They've already been through the worst-case scenario. So your little mind games, they don't hit. You go silent hoping they'll chase you. They don't. You act distant hoping they'll fight for you. They don't. You throw a fit hoping they'll apologize. They don't. They just let you go. And that breaks people's brains, because suddenly the power is gone. Let me tell you why this is so unsettling. Most people are used to push and pull dynamics. Someone pulls away, and the other person chases. Someone acts cold, and the other person works harder for warmth. It's a dance, a game, a way to test worth, and it works. On people who are insecure, on people who are afraid of abandonment, on people who measure their value by how much others want them. But trauma-born loners, they don't chase, not because they don't care, but because they've learned that people who want to stay will stay. They don't beg, they don't plead, they don't convince. They just accept the reality and move on. And when you're used to people fighting for you, when you're used to your absence creating panic, suddenly being around someone who's just fine without you, that's the shake, because it forces you to confront the question, if nobody's chasing me, do I have any real value? And that's a hard pill to swallow. Let's talk about boundaries. Most people say they respect boundaries, but what they really mean is, I respect boundaries that don't inconvenience me. They're fine with boundaries, as long as those boundaries don't block them from getting what they want. But trauma-born loners, they have non-negotiable boundaries, because they know what life feels like without them. They've been violated, disrespected, taken advantage of, drained dry, so they built walls, not to keep everyone out, but to protect what's left of their peace. And when someone crosses a line, or tries to, the loner doesn't explode. They don't yell, they don't argue, they don't give you a second chance. They just leave quietly, calmly, permanently. And that is what triggers people. Because in that moment, in that clean, quiet exit, your entitlement gets exposed. You expected forgiveness without accountability. You expected access without respect. You expected closeness without safety. And the loner said no. And that no, that firm, unapologetic boundary, it shatters the illusion that you're owed anything. Here's the truth nobody wants to admit. People hate boundaries because boundaries limit control. When someone has strong boundaries, you can't manipulate them. You can't guilt them. You can't pressure them into doing what you want. You have to actually respect them. And for people who are used to getting their way, through charm or intimidation or emotional leverage, that's unbearable. So they do what people always do when they can't control someone. They attack the boundary itself. You're too rigid. You're cold. You're difficult. You're overreacting. No, the boundary is healthy. You're just upset that it's blocking you from something you feel entitled to. And trauma-born loners, they see through this instantly because they've heard it all before. So when someone pushes back against their boundaries, When someone tries to guilt them into lowering the wall, they don't argue. They just add distance, and that distance is the shake. Here's something most people don't realize they do. They subconsciously feel reassured when others shrink. When someone over-explains, when someone apologizes excessively, when someone nervously fills the silence, when someone makes themselves smaller to fit into someone else's comfort zone. That behavior signals, I'm not a threat, I'm manageable, I'm controllable. And for people who need to feel in control, consciously or not, that's comforting. But trauma-born loners, they don't do that anymore. They're not shrinking. They're not over-explaining. They're not nervously filling the air with chatter. They're just calm, steady, self-contained. And that lack of collapse, that refusal to make themselves smaller, can feel intimidating to people who need others to shrink in order to feel big. Because when someone is grounded, when they're comfortable in their own skin, when they're not looking for approval or reassurance, it highlights how ungrounded you are. Let me describe what it actually looks like when someone is self-possessed. They walk into a room, and they're not scanning for validation. They're not checking to see who noticed them. They're not adjusting their energy to match the crowd. They're not performing. They're just present. They speak, and then they don't over-explain. They don't justify. They don't apologize for taking up space. They're misunderstood, and they're okay with it, because they know who they are, and they don't need external consensus to confirm it. And when someone disagrees with them, or dislikes them, or tries to start a conflict, they don't take the bait. They just stay calm, not because they're cold, but because they're not dependent on anyone's opinion to maintain their sense of self. And that level of internal stability is deeply unsettling to people who've built their entire identity on external feedback, because it exposes the difference between confidence and performance. Confidence doesn't need an audience, performance does. And trauma-born loners? They stopped performing a long time ago. Here's another thing that sets people off. Trauma-born loners don't speak in cliches. They're not quoting self-help books. They're not parroting Instagram captions. They're not performing wisdom. When they talk about pain, about healing, and about survival, there's weight to it, because they lived it. They didn't read about it. They didn't watch a documentary. They didn't attend a seminar. They were in it for years, sometimes decades. So when they speak, there's a depth that's hard to fake. And that depth, it's uncomfortable for people who are still living in theory. For people who've read all the books, who talk about growth and healing and boundaries, but haven't actually done the work. Because suddenly they're face to face with someone who has done the work. And the difference is obvious. It's the difference between someone who talks about running a marathon and someone who's actually run one. You can tell. And that contrast and that gap between theory and lived experience, it's the shake. Let me give you an example. Someone who's read about trauma says things like, you have to set boundaries and practice self-care. Someone who's lived through trauma says, I stopped answering calls from people who only reached out when they needed something. It was lonely at first, but eventually I realized I'd rather be alone than drained. See the difference? One is a concept. The other is a decision with consequences, with weight, with scars. Trauma-born loners carry that weight. And when people are around them, people who are still living in concepts, it becomes clear who's actually walked the path and who's just read the map. And that clarity? That's the shake. Here's something wild. People tend to react to trauma-born loners in one of two ways. Either A, they feel drawn to them, curious, inspired. They think, I want to understand myself the way they understand themselves. Or B, they feel defensive, uncomfortable, irritated. They think, there's something wrong with them, they're too intense, too cold, too much. Neutral reactions are rare. Why? Because self-possession highlights self-avoidance. When someone is grounded, when they're not performing, when they're not seeking approval, it forces everyone around them to look at themselves. And some people use that as an opportunity for growth, but others, they project, they blame, they criticize. They create narratives about why the loner is broken or difficult or unlikable, because it's easier to attack the mirror than to look at what it's reflecting. Let's break this down. When you're around someone who's healed or healing, it highlights the parts of you that haven't. If they've done the work to set boundaries and you haven't, Their boundaries feel like judgment. If they've learned to sit with discomfort, and you haven't, their calm feels like coldness. If they've stopped people-pleasing, and you haven't, their refusal to cater to you feels like rejection. But it's not about you, it's about them protecting their peace. But ego doesn't see it that way. Ego sees someone who won't bend, and interprets it as a threat. So it attacks, it calls them cold, arrogant, detached, difficult. Anything to avoid the real question. Why does their self-possession bother me so much? And trauma-born loners, they see this pattern too. They've been blamed for other people's discomfort their whole lives. So they don't defend themselves. They just step back. And that absence, that quiet exit, often forces people to finally confront what they've been avoiding. Here's the most important part. Trauma-born loners aren't trying to shake anyone. They're not trying to intimidate. They're not trying to dominate. They're not trying to provoke. They're just being internally aligned. They're living according to their values. They're honoring their boundaries. They're showing up as themselves, without apology and without performance. And the shaking happens as a side effect, because alignment is disruptive. In a world where most people are fragmented, where they say one thing and do another, where they present a polished version of themselves while hiding the mess underneath, someone who's whole stands out. Not because they're trying to, but because wholeness is rare. And when people encounter it, they either grow toward it or push away from it, but they can't ignore it. Alignment doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean having it all figured out. It means your actions match your values. You say you value honesty? You tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. You say you value your peace? You protect it, even when people call you selfish. You say you don't tolerate disrespect? You leave when someone disrespects you, even if you love them. Trauma-born loners have alignment, not because they're better than anyone else, but because they've already lost everything. They've been broken, betrayed, abandoned, so they rebuilt carefully, unintentionally, with clear boundaries about what they will and won't accept. And that clarity, that coherence between what they say and what they do, that's what shakes people, because most people are incoherent. They say they want respect but accept disrespect. They say they value themselves but shrink to fit others' expectations. They say they're done with drama but keep engaging with it. And when they're around someone who's not incoherent, someone who actually lives their truth, it exposes the gap. And that gap is uncomfortable. So when someone says, "Be careful with trauma-born loners," what does that actually mean? It doesn't mean fear them. It doesn't mean avoid them. It means don't approach them with manipulation. Don't try to guilt them. Don't try to charm them into compromising their boundaries. Don't assume they'll play the same social games everyone else plays. Don't test their boundaries. They're not bluffing. If they say no, they mean no. If they step back, they're gone. Don't push and assume they'll cave. Don't expect access without respect. You can't treat them poorly and expect them to stick around because that's just how relationships work. They've already survived worse than your absence. Don't project your unresolved wounds onto them. If their calm makes you uncomfortable, if their boundaries feel like rejection, if their self-possession feels like arrogance, that's your issue. Don't make it theirs, because they won't absorb it. They won't take on your emotional baggage, they'll just leave. Let me tell you what happens when a trauma-born loner walks away from someone. At first, the person feels relief. Good. They were too intense anyway, too difficult, too much. But then, after the initial comfort fades, something else sets in. Why didn't they care enough to stay? Why was it so easy for them to let me go? And that's when the real shake happens, because suddenly you're forced to confront the truth. They didn't let you go because you were worthless. They let you go because they knew their worth. And they weren't going to compromise it. Not for you, not for anyone. And that realization? That's what breaks people open, because it forces them to ask, do I know my worth? And for most people, the answer is no. If you've made it this far, if you've listened to all of this and felt something shift inside you, then you've got a choice to make. You can do what most people do. Click away, forget about it. Go back to the comfortable patterns you've always known. Or you can sit with the discomfort. You can ask yourself the hard questions. Am I living in alignment? Do I have real boundaries, or just the idea of them? Am I whole on my own, or am I a collection of other people's expectations? Do I shrink to fit, or do I stand in my truth? And if those questions make you uncomfortable, good, that's the shake. That's growth trying to happen. And if you're brave enough to sit with it, to really look at yourself, to stop avoiding the uncomfortable truths, then you're on your way to becoming the kind of person whom you can actually respect. Not because you're perfect, but because you're real. And if you're one of them, if you're listening to this and nodding because you've lived every word of it, I see you. I know you didn't choose this path. I know you didn't want to become hyper-observant, didn't want to learn to protect yourself at all costs, didn't want to spend years rebuilding after everything fell apart. But you did, and somewhere along the way, in all that pain, in all that isolation, you became unshakable, not because you're cold, but because you're clear. And that clarity, it's rare, it's powerful, and it's threatening to people who are still living in fog. So keep standing in your truth. Keep honoring your boundaries. Keep refusing to shrink, because the world needs more people who are real, even if it doesn't always know how to handle them. If this hit you in any way, if it made you think, if it made you feel seen or uncomfortable or both, subscribe to the channel, because I'm going to keep making content about the uncomfortable truths nobody else wants to talk about. And drop a comment below. Tell me, are you the trauma-born loner, or are you the person trying to understand them? Let's talk about it, because the only way we grow is by getting real. And if you've made it this far, you're ready for that. See you in the next one. Till then, keep growing, my friends.